Welcome to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols. Our guest today is Frances Schoonmaker, retired educator, 25 years, who has transitioned to writing award-winning middle grade fiction that entertains and inspires young readers. As a professor of Teachers College, Columbia University, she directed the graduate program in elementary and middle school education, a program fortunately drawing heavily on story and children's literature. She headed the curriculum development team for the Lincoln Center Institute's Teaching Artists program and a doctoral seminar that explored children's literature and spirituality funded by the Spencer Foundation. Earlier in her career, she had 5 books published in the Poetry for Young People series. Last year, we had the pleasure of interviewing her about her YA trilogy, The Last Crystal, which manages to evolve time travel, magic, and a 3-generation saga that spans from 1856 to 1944 on the Santa Fe Trail. Today, we're back on the Santa Fe Trail with a new book, Sid Johnson and the Phantom Slave Stealer. We're very pleased to welcome back Frances Schoonmaker.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be back.
We had a fun interview last time, and I have to follow up on one item from that. You were a recipient of I think it was the 2019 Agatha Award for the Best Middle Grade Young Adult Mystery. And last year you told us it was a teapot, and they hadn't sent it due to the pandemic. So my question is, has it arrived yet?
It has. And actually, I could show it to you, except it's across the room and I'd have to get up and leave the camera. But I do have it. I haven't had any tea in it, though. It was pretty exciting to actually finally claim that award.
Well, with the pandemic messed up a lot of stuff in today.
Yeah, it did, didn't it?
Yeah. In preparation for today's interview, I checked out your Amazon page and I found a gem that you'd posted on there. I have to share it with our audiences. You wrote, "My first published work was a mystery that appeared in a serial in the high school newspaper. It was complete with an astonishing number of bodies and a fireplace with sconces, one of which was a key to a secret passage." So, in some sense, you were always going to find a way to be a writer.
I think probably that's true. And I attribute that to, my parents. My mother was always saying, when she'd hear a good story, she'd say, "Oh, that would make a great book."
Ah, good.
So we were always, busy in imaginative play and
Mhm.
and being read to, which I think is key.
Absolutely. Also, I kind of feel like there's in the titles and the background of this, I kind of feel you're inspired a little bit by, say, the Nancy Drew or Tom Swift wonderful series that some of us grew up with. And in the new title, Sid Johnson and the Phantom Slave Stealer, that's kind of a title of like Nancy Drew and the Hidden Staircase or Tom Swift and the City of Gold. It's maybe unconscious, but it resonates for some of us out here.
I think we always write from who we are. And yes, I read the Bobbsey twins, I read Nancy Drew, I read the Hardy Boys, I read everything I could get my hands on, and every possible genre. Anything that wasn't up on the top shelf that we weren't supposed to read, and then we found ways to get to those too.
Good for you. Good for you. This there's a tie. I'm sorry. The new book does not have a lot of the elements that the trilogy did in terms of time travel or
Mhm.
magic or any of that thing, but there's some overlapping connections between it. One being the Santa Fe Trail, but also some of the characters.
Right. I wrote this book because when I wrote the trilogy, I piloted it in classrooms. I had asked teachers who were kind enough to read it to their kids, and then I came and met with them, and they had really good suggestions. But one thing that happened in all the classrooms that absolutely astonished and thrilled me was they said, um, "We like this, but could you also make your next book about somebody who goes all the way to California?" They wanted the history.
Ah,
And I was so excited about that. So as I began thinking about, all right, if I promised them I would do that, and where do I get a handle on that? And I thought about a character from the Black Alabaster Box that I really fell in love with. I just thought he was such a nice kid, and I thought, well, what would his backstory be?
mhm.
And right now, the Underground Railroad is really important again, as it should be. And there's a lot of interest. So I thought, well, And so I decided to locate a family in southern Illinois because it was right is a border state, and there was a presence of Underground Railroad. And I thought it would be interesting to see what would cause them to give up that sense of mission they had and go west. There were so many motives that people had for taking the trails west. And I think I was still wrapped up in the Santa Fe Trail because last year was the 200th anniversary of the trail. And I belong to the Santa Fe Trail Association because I think it's important to support it. And so I think that's probably what happened.
Hmm. Well, it's interesting because there's so many nice historical details in that, and some of the things that I was intrigued by were food storage in an era long before refrigeration is,
Right.
and you talked about them storing bacon in bran and eggs in cornmeal in barrels. Never thought about that, but it's also those are two other food sources that they're taking with them. They're combining
Right.
two types of food. I thought it was absolutely fascinating stuff. And you worked in a few little bits of history too. Yeah, there's one point you said, didn't Josiah Gregg write a book about the West? Sid asks, and they say, yeah, the first book about the Santa Fe Trail. So I think you're leaving little treasures for kids to go, I wonder what that's about, and go find.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would defy them to try to read Josiah Gregg.
Oh,
It's a challenge, but you are right. You can't help but leave those bits because it's part of the context. But it also is intentional. I mean, the first thing has to be a good story,
hmm,
because if you spend too much time worrying about, a moral stance or, getting history fed into kids, then that diverts your purpose. But in the telling of what you hope is a good story, there are so many opportunities to educate.
absolutely. And as again, I take notes as I read, and this quote came to me. It said, Sid decided the nicest thing about Mrs. Payne was that she had a way of explaining things without making you think she was trying to get you to learn something you didn't want to know. I think that sounds like a good description of you.
Well, thank you. I take that as a compliment. But yes, I think that any good teacher is able to make things interesting and exciting. And let's face it, there's some things that we learn that aren't interesting and exciting.
Hmm.
And kids will give you a lot of latitude if most of their day is interesting and involving, and then they've got to memorize something, and you say, this is not going to be so much fun, but we need to do it. They're far more willing than if the whole day is force feeding.
Yeah,
So, and I kind of felt like Mrs. Payne was that kind of person. She just was going to make it alive and fun.
yeah. It's kind of a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down, kind of a
Right.
thought. There are a lot of interesting things happening here. I think you managed to have quite a discussion about slavery without actually having a discussion about slavery in the way it weaves into the story. I found that fascinating.
Oh, good. I'm glad that worked for you.
Yeah.
Um, but you can imagine the kinds of discussions that would have gone on privately
Hmm.
in in a home where they were trying to keep it from the kids. And and then when Sid becomes involved, because at first he doesn't know that his parents are involved in the Underground Railroad, and it's disillusioning for him when he discovers that they are, because it sort of contradicts his moral code. You know, he's not for slavery, but he's not for breaking the law, and he realizes that his parents could be caught, and if they are caught, there would be consequences, which might mean, because they don't have extended family in the area, that he'd be responsible for his younger brother and sister. So, it's jarring to him, and he has to figure out what he's going to do, and also, what his own stance is going to be.
Which reminds me, this is in many ways a coming of age story as well.
Yeah, it is. I think he does a lot of growing up, even though he doesn't grow in years. By the end, I think when we reach the end of the book, he knows a great deal more. He has a stronger sense of himself and what he believes is worth standing up for.
And a sense of responsibility, I think, that
Yeah,
comes with that. I think that's
yeah,
part of his character that's very appealing, is that he wants to do the right thing.
right. I wanted a story about a kid, and this is why I picked him, a good kid, a kid who didn't have superpowers, who wouldn't be doing anything that the kids your children or grandchildren, wouldn't be able to do if they were placed in those circumstances. And a kid who had a loving family. Um,
Yeah.
so, as authors, we often depend on having a parent dead in order to make something exciting. And
Yeah.
and I wanted him to come out of a perfect family, no, but a loving family.
Right.
And his dad rants about things, as people do.
Yes.
And I'm sure if we get deeper into it, we'll find that his mother is not the perfect mother, but they're a good family. And so I wanted Sid to demonstrate this. Now, does it all come out perfect in the end? Actually, it doesn't. It isn't easily resolved, and Sid doesn't get the answers he was hoping for. But at the end, he understands why he can't have the answers.
Hmm.
And I feel like that's really an important conclusion to the book. But he does leave, they're in Council Grove at the end of the story. They've started west on the Santa Fe Trail. They had to leave Southern Illinois behind because their farm was compromised. They could no longer serve in that sense of mission. Sid thinks he's going to leave that behind when they get on the trail, but he discovers that, no, we don't leave that behind. And I suppose that's my way of reminding us that we haven't left those issues behind, even
Unfortunately.
now.
Yeah.
But
That is.
at the end, he has a different feeling about both about going west, which he wasn't eager to do, and also about what he knows and why things turn out the way they do.
I also want to mention that you put a little kind of twist of pre-feminism in there, if you will, without being as such, because and I have here's my two quotes that he was glad he was old enough to go through the line with the older boys right after the men. Some of the girls said it wasn't fair, but that's just girls for you, he thought. That's one of them. And the other one is Grace leaned over and asked Sid, "How come it's just the men voting?" "That's just how it is," said Sid. So, without preaching, without you just kind of work in that, hey, there's an imbalance here. I
Yeah.
found that really nicely subtle.
Yeah, and I kind of like that Ma, his mother says, she has a point
Yes, yes,
about the voting. We're going west too.
yeah, yeah. Interesting stuff. I have a feeling that you enjoy writing. Or do you enjoy the process as much as you enjoy having written?
Oh, absolutely. That's what keeps me most interested is getting the idea, an initial idea, and it somehow it never turns out quite the way I plot it. I'm one of those writers who has to discover it as I go.
Mhm.
That was always true. If I had a term paper that was due and I had to turn in an outline, I had to write the paper before I could do the outline. But then the outline was really important because then it became a way of checking the paper and find out where the holes were. So I still work that way and allow the characters and what I find out um, to help build the story. And I learned a lot in doing research for the story. I draw the name slave stealer in the book from the research I did. I didn't know anything about slave stealers. I hadn't heard the term, but it was used in two ways. It referred to people who stole people held in slavery and resold them, which was horrible. I mean, the whole thing was horrible. But just imagine thinking you might be free and then you really aren't. Um, and then it was used starting probably with Jonathan Walker, who was a very famous abolitionist. He had been involved in um, trying to help some freedom seekers by taking them on his boat. He was going to get them to Barbados because he got sick and there was a storm. They were arrested, all put in prison. Um, the freedom seekers were beaten. He had a terrible time in prison. He was taken out after several months and put in stocks, and his hand was branded with an SS for slave stealer. Now, branding occurred, with the African American people held in slavery. But as Frederick Douglass said, probably the fact that this happened to a white man called more attention to the dilemma and the issues than anything else might have done. And he devoted his life to giving lectures, and he let people see his hand. But one of the things I admired about him was he did not have a white savior mentality. He never claimed that what he endured was greater than what the people he was trying to advocate for had been through. And he was apparently very open about that. But this SS, slave stealer, really intrigued me. And I do talk about that on my website and my blog a little bit. It's kind of part of the backstory, and it is why I chose that title.
Let's mention where people can find your blog and your website.
Okay, I know Schoonmaker is not that easy to remember. The website is fschoonmaker.com. But if people want to use the search engine and just put the Phantom Slave Stealer, then they can find about probably more than they'll want to know about me. But that does bring up a point. If your listeners do decide to go to the website, I have a contact page and I would love to hear from them. And I really like to hear where they heard about it. So I would love to hear that, they were listening and decided to follow up, and, whether they're going to buy a book. I mean, I'd love them to buy it, but whether they're interested in buying books or just curious, I always love to hear from people.
I have a feeling you're not just an author, you're a resource.
Well, I still do some educational consulting, or occasionally a conference I'll be asked. I'm doing a lot of virtual things now,
Yes. Yeah.
especially in overseas things, because people found out we can have somebody from the US or from Europe or from Asia, just simply by going virtual. So in, I think, the middle of October, I'll have to check my dates again. I'm actually going to be participating in a conference at Foreman University in Lahore in Pakistan.
Whoa.
And it was supposed to be in September, but it's been put off because of the flooding. So yeah, I do serve as a resource.
Well, all that experience, all of those teaching moments, your background, your research, your writing, um, I just have a funny feeling that when you go into a classroom, kids just are excited to see you there.
Well, sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, I do have a lot of fun with it. And it's been interesting to learn how to interact with kids, on a platform like this one.
Mhm.
Um, and during the pandemic, I was, cooperating with our Sunday school team at my church, and we had to think about how are we going to involve them and do something, because they were driving their parents crazy,
Yeah.
and each other crazy. And so we developed these packets, and I would go mail them every week to each of the kids. And then, on Sunday, we would have the Zoom, but there would be stuff they could work with, so that it could be interactive. And so I think, inventing and finding new ways to do things is probably part of what keeps me going. But I love the research. I love the figuring out the puzzle of, what would happen if, or how come that.
Hmm.
So Sid Johnson is out, and I'm working on the next leg of the trip, because I just couldn't get him to California in one book.
Well, there's so much going on here. I will say this: it's for a book with size. It's not only a quick read; it's a very detailed read, and there's a lot of good stuff in here.
Oh, thank you.
Uh, One little interesting tidbit that I ran across is when they travel a bit on a boat as they need to get from one place to the other, and he gets seasick, and this fellow says, smell a newspaper," and I've never heard of that before. Is that a classic remedy for that?
It is. I didn't know that seasickness could, you somehow it would help to breathe into a newspaper. But in doing the research for this, I, um, I came across that, and I thought, well, of course, that would be marvelous. There has to be something besides ginger tea and biscuits
Yeah.
that you could have used then. And that whole sickness came because I think it was my daughter was reading, and she said, well, now I can't imagine people who've never ridden a steamboat being on the Missouri River, which was a very unpredictable, choppy river, and the sandbanks were always changing. She said, without somebody being seasick. And I thought, oh, yeah. And then it comes back to what if? And okay, so if that happens, what happened? How would it shake out? So again, it sends me off on a trail and it becomes interesting. And that's really what I enjoy so much.
Well, that's what people love, is to finding these lovely little tidbits in all of the writing. At least that's what grabs me when I start taking notes.
Oh,
Um,
did you notice? I'm sorry if I'm interrupting, but did you notice that Mr. Nichols, under another name, actually makes a cameo in the book?
yes, I've forgotten that. I was
I
going to
thought
mention that. Yeah.
I thought it would be fun if one of the characters who's part of the fantasy in the first three books actually appeared, just for kids who've read the other books,
Yes.
to be able to enjoy that. And also it's part of my feeling, that we're absolutely surrounded by everyday magic. We like Emily Dickinson said, the world, every bush is a flame, but only those who see take off their shoes.
Yes. See, that comes from your poetry background in all the books you wrote. One of them was about Emily Dickinson, as I
Yes, it
recall.
was. Uh-huh.
Indeed. Well, you've been generous with your time. I want to close out with a couple of questions. One is there anything we've not touched on that we want to make sure that our audience knows about?
Well, I would like to say that this is not a white savior story. That Sid's family is deeply involved in the Underground Railroad. They are concerned enough to put their lives along on the line, but they recognize they're not, the ultimate rescuers. That they do their bit along the way, and I try to make a point that while in the end Sid does some rescuing, his family recognize that he has been rescued more than once,
Yeah.
you know, and so to me, that's really, really important. The other thing is, I'm a white woman and I share all the benefits of white privilege. So I don't pretend to try to write from the perspective of a Black African American or someone who's, been held in slavery. What I can do, and I think it's important for me to do, is to try to look at it through the eyes of a kid. And so that is what I try to do. And hopefully, and again, I'm always happy to hear, from readers and listeners. Hopefully, that's what I do in that book, um, because I think that's really an important reminder.
And finally, what do you hope they take away from the book when they close it?
I want them to leave with a feeling of hope, of the importance of kindness, um, with the importance of trying to find better ways of being in the world. And actually, I hope they'll leave feeling like they've been on a really wild ride. It's been fun.
I think they will do that, and they will hunger for the next book in this series. Thank you so much. Our guest today has been Francis Schoonmaker. The book is Sid Johnson and the Phantom Slave Stealer. Highly recommended. Bless you. Thank you for your time, and keep up the excellent work.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.